Hi, and welcome to the first episode of our new podcast, Black Panther Party, Terrorists or Human Rights Activists, presented by me, Theon, with special guests from the Northumbria History Department, Megan,
Hi.
Flynn,
Hello.
and Alex.
Hi.
We are doing this podcast as part of Black History Month for young people who are interested in the civil rights movement and want to know more. In this episode, we'll be discussing the Black Panther Party movement and its leadership. I think we can start by looking at how the Black Panther Party differs from organisations of the civil rights movement. Flynn, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I've been looking at the views of a historian called Colette Gator.
Okay.
She says that the Panthers were a part of a broader militant Black Power movement, inspired by individuals such as Stokely Carmichael, Frantz Fanon, and Malcolm X.
Mm-hmm.
The movement differed from the civil rights movement, as the civil rights movement used the tactics of non-violence and passive resistance,
Okay.
which were often condoned by the politicians at the time. But the Black Power leaders broke this tradition by aligning with the international freedom fighters in order to form a transformative worldwide liberation movement that focused on, instead of using passive resistance, using armed self-defense against police brutality.
Yeah, totally agree. There was some time when one of the members of the NAACP called the Black Panther movement the father of hatred and the mother of violence. So they always portrayed themselves as the authentic voice of the outraged and exploited Black community. The violence really that they used really highlighted this. Like, they always used it to stand against, the peaceful and the movements that just doesn't get anywhere.
Okay, yeah.
I think definitely.
The art and the speeches of the Black Panther Party also shows the shift in the tactics used by the civil rights movement. We can see this in images of Black people confidently wielding guns and aiming them at police officers who are anthropomorphized as pigs. We can look at Carmichael's speech in 1966 as well to illustrate this. He says that the only time he hears people talking about non-violence is when Black people move to defend themselves against the white population. However, when white people beat up Black people, nobody taught it. And he also talks about how as soon as Black people try to defend themselves, this double standard always presents itself.
Definitely.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, yeah. Like the Panthers, like, they were known for, they would always wear like commando clothing and like adopt this military style, and it was just constant. They always they carried the rifles around with them all the time, and they always said that they were always going to be out looking for like police misconduct and mistreating of the Black community. And Huey Newton himself said in an interview, he said that we would stand at a distance where the police couldn't say that we were interfering with their arrest or the detention of the individual, and make sure that there was no brutality. Like, they never just went in head first with the violence. They were looking for it. They were aware, but they weren't brutal until they needed to be. The violence always came later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I quite agree with what everyone said so far. The Black Panther Party was originally set up so more as a defence against the police and to ensure there was less police brutality against Black people. So they took up you got guns and they took up arms against police to ensure this wouldn't happen. But then you compare it to someone like the NAACP or the student movement, where they were very much pacifists. No violence at all came from them. So at one point in the Black Panther Party there was 21 members arrested for terrorism as well. So
wow.
Yeah, as well as I think a lot of people forget as well, as much as they were different from the other parties and that they were violent and they used a violent tactic rather than peaceful, it wasn't just that. The party, they did actually they did a lot of things for their communities.
I think that's important to remember.
Yeah, they for one of the best instances was when they set up the free breakfast for children program, and in several interviews at the time that they brought this out, they said they'd done the research, they really looked into it, and they found that a good breakfast was really, really beneficial for kids, and it helped them in school. They were productive, things like that. So like they set up the program and
Did a lot of good for community and stuff.
yeah, totally. It was all to benefit their communities. Like one of the members of the party, David Lennox, he said that the whole program was aimed to show love for their people, for their communities, and part of their peak, they were serving about 20,000 meals to people in 19 different communities. Like, as much as they're remembered for the violent tactics and the opposite standpoint to the peaceful protests, like, people forget how much good they actually did for their community. Like,
I would definitely agree with that. Like, if you all you have to do is look at the 10 demands that they had, like when they originally set up the party. Like in the 10th one, for example, is all they want is land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace. Like, that's not the aim of violence.
Yeah, that's always forgotten. Definitely, people just focus on the violence. They forget that the points actually did hold really nice messages.
Yeah, I agree with Alex and Megan. Some historians have pointed out how the Black Panther Party focused on human rights. One historian, Meredith Roman, presents this view. He says that the Black Panther Party differed from other civil rights movements as they conceptualized themselves as human rights activists. In fact, when the organization was created by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, they established the goal of the movement as promoting the achievement of all our human rights, including the right to defend ourselves against any threat to the actual achievement of those rights.
Really?
Yeah. And they define these rights in terms of social and economic rights, and endeavoured to address, as Megan said, the gross disparities in housing, education, and employment that the civil rights movement had largely left untouched.
Yeah, glossed over.
Yeah, totally. Because even before the movement, since even before the 1930s, even there was a massive disparity in housing and everything.
Yeah.
Like there was literally measures put in place just to ensure that black people didn't get housing, couldn't actually. They were barred from renting and applying for mortgages and things like that. Like there was a massive unfairness in the country for a long time before the movement, and it just got highlighted so much when this party came about.
Yeah, and I also want to say as well, the Black Panther Party definitely stood out as a movement because it was very dangerous to invoke the phrase human rights in the United States during that period.
100%.
Since the early 1950s, American anti-communists had stigmatized human rights discourse as like un-American and treasonous and Soviet-inspired.
Since McCarthyism and stuff like that,
Yeah. And this encouraged leaders of civil rights organizations such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People to remake the organization as quintessentially American and concerned with just preserving political and legal rights alone.
Okay, yeah.
But the BP, the Black Panther Party, rejected that notion, and they said that human rights was consistent with American traditions.
Okay.
And they often cited documents such as the Constitution to support their claim.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely. I think as well, just to add on at the end, like to bring it back to how they were different, like when the leader Huey Newton, when he got arrested after he'd been accused of murdering white Oakland police officer John Frey, he was arrested and charged with the murder, and following the, we hope, wrongful accusation, there was a campaign, almost a movement, the Free Huey campaign to appeal for his release from jail because he was facing the death penalty, and a lot of people speculated that it was just because he was black and because he was in a position of power with being one of the leaders and the co-founder of the party. But this movement, it managed to gain the support of people from all different like races, ethnicities, backgrounds. Like you look at footage from the campaign, and there's the Black Panther members like marching around. There's groups of black women singing songs with lyrics all about freeing him, but then at the same time within the crowds holding signposts and placards and everything, there's white people, there's Asian people, there's people from all different backgrounds. And it something like that. Just it managed to pull together like all the different groups within society. It's like people forgot about the color of his skin. Like it was just It was, a lot of people said at the time that it was like all it took for you to sympathize with this was to be human, like to see that this wrongful conviction needed to be right, and like it united everyone for once throughout the civil rights period. It managed to unite people.
Yeah.
Where a lot of the time when you see black protests and activism and that, you just see the opposition to them from everyone else. It's rare that there was instances with people, white people, Asian people, all different types of people coming together like that and actually uniting on something.
I think that leads on quite nice to our next point. We're going to look at how effective was the leadership of the Black Panther Party. Anyone want to start on that? That's all?
Yeah. A bit of background on the leaders. There was the two founders, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. Newton arguably was the more influential of the two.
Yeah, I agree with that.
He was often seen as the visionary of the group. He was the visionary leader for the party. He was always well known, like everyone knew who Huey Newton was. He was quite infamous throughout the establishment of the party, right from the early days. Unfortunately, he spent a lot of time in incarceration throughout the lifetime of the party. This time in prison was really damaging to him. He spent a considerable amount of time in solitary confinement, where he would just be himself in a locked room with no windows, just a dark cell on his own, left to his own devices with nothing. And you should never be left in solitary confinement for more than a few days at a time, because this can have like long-term irrevocable effects. And he spent up to 2 years solid in this place. So like,
do you think this like affected how the leadership of the Black Panther Party was like run at the time then, because he was in
Absolutely. I think with his, while he was in jail, like someone had to fill his shoes. And while he was in there, I know Eldridge Cleaver took a lot of responsibility in like being the face of the party. He was the personality. And then even when Newton came out of jail after his time in solitary confinement, his time in prison in general, he was a completely different person. He was not the same leader he was when he went in.
No.
He was constantly paranoid. His mental health just continued to deteriorate until his death. It just wasn't the same. His leadership definitely wasn't as effective after his time in prison, because he was not the same person.
And that had a negative effect on the party.
Absolutely, because people started to doubt him and doubt his party, saying that if they didn't have a stable leader, how could they be an effective party? It was always argued after his time in jail. But Eldridge Cleaver, as I said, it was Newton and Bobby Seale who were the founders. But Eldridge Cleaver came in later. He, following his time in prison himself, he came and he, just prior to or around the time of his release, he released the book Soul on Ice.
Okay.
This was like essays, letters, reflections from his time spent in jail. Mm-hmm. It was really highly praised. Everyone was reading it. It was praised even by the New York Times, which was surprising given he was a black writer in this
unusual
period.
At the time, yeah.
Yeah, it was quite significant. So when he joined, they gained a celebrity aspect to it. He was often seen as the personality, like I said, of the party. He made it credible to intellectuals, and also white left leaning into intellectuals. Also, like, he opened the party up. He brought this new audience in, almost. He was really good with his words. He was a really good orator. His only fault was that he had a lot to say, and it wasn't always right. So he did end up getting some people into sticky situations because of what he said. So he wasn't the best for the party, really, I don't think.
Even though
he brought that celebrity,
there was other drawbacks to his.
Definitely. Like, this man is not someone that I would like to be in power. Like, he was really well known for characterizing rape as an insurrectionary act against the white society.
Yeah.
I don't agree with that at all. Like, one writer said in an interview, Martin X, he argued, he said, who could be in an organisation with Eldridge and not have him be the leader? Wow. Nobody. Like, he was almost a force to be reckoned with, in that he couldn't be led. He had to lead. Definitely.
I definitely agree with Megan's point that Newton was a profoundly skilled writer. And I've looked at the historians Joshua Bloom and Martin Waldo to support this. They examined one of his essays called "The Correct Handling of a Revolution," and in this writing, in this essay, he draws upon the writings of Malcolm X and the psychiatrist Fanon, who participated in the Algerian Revolution.
Really? Oh.
Mm-hmm. And he expands upon the revolutionary movement in Algeria by comparing the black communities in the ghettos of the United States with the people who were colonized in Algeria. And he does this by linking both the conditions and the struggle for liberation in those two areas. He also brings up the example of the intervention in Vietnam by the United States. He develops his argument by applying Frantz Fanon's theory of the psychology of colonization to the ghettos of the United States. He basically interprets the police as an occupying force, and just 2 seconds to get it.
No worries. Well, while you think of your point, there was one thing that I heard Newton say in an interview once that I thought was really interesting. It was why they actually called themselves the Black Panthers. And he said, we use the Black Panther as our symbol because the nature of the Panther doesn't strike anyone, but when the assailant comes, he backs up first. But then if the aggressor continues, then he'll strike out. And I just think it speaks really true to the party, in that they weren't always the ones to instigate. Like, they waited until it was necessary. And when they felt it necessary, then they would strike out. And I thought it was really interesting when I was looking. It was on the documentary, the Black Panther Party, Vanguard for a Revolution. Back from 2015, was released at Sundance Festival initially. Really interesting. It's about 2 hours long. It has a lot of interviews from the time, a lot of footage that we haven't been able to see before. No. And they did a lot of interviews with members of the party now, bringing it back, like, not just looking at it back then, like actually interviewing people who were in the party now. Really, really interesting.
I'll have to give that a watch.
Definitely, I would absolutely recommend it. It's been praised for its relevance and stuff.
As I was saying before, he was comparing the police in the ghettos of the United States to the Algerian, the French people who colonized Algeria, and he also related the Black Panther Party to the revolutionaries in Algeria itself.
Do you think this was effective by doing this? Say any sort of things?
Well, yes, because I think it gives African Americans inspiration from other successful revolutionary movements, such as the one in Algeria.
So my point about how the leadership of the Black Panther Party was structured and how effective it was, ultimately the FBI had to try and infiltrate the leadership, and they had in the documentary I've watched it, they had an informant in. They were so worried about what this party could achieve that they've had to
put someone in there.
To gather information. The other problem with the leadership was that it was quite sexist in a way. So when Newton ends up going to prison, he appoints Elaine Brown, I think her name is. Elaine Brown to lead. And basically, when he comes out of prison, he has this problem with
women in power.
Yeah, with women in power, and he doesn't like the majority. There was actually a majority of women had high leadership like positions within the party this time. And
It's really interesting.
Brown herself, in her memoir says that a woman in the Black Power movement was considered at best irrelevant. A woman asserting herself was a pariah. If a black woman assumed a role of leadership, she was said to be eroding black manhood, to be hindering the progress of the black race, and she was an enemy of the black people. So this coming from the leader for many years of the Black Panther Party is like quite
shocking, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
Do you think that's a problem with the leadership at the time, like the male leaders at the time, or do you think that's a problem with the society at the time? Do you think that's because the time when Black Panther movement maybe was?
It's probably a bit of both, isn't it? Like, because at the time women weren't being seen as
no, absolutely. I feel like it's quite reflective of the society at the time because the party was founded. It was only founded in 1966.
Yeah.
So it was still quite the society with its separate spheres.
Yeah.
The women belong at home, the men belong at work. I feel like it was quite reflective of that still. The breakfast initiative that I mentioned before. Throughout that was largely run by men because there was quite a sexist element to the party. The women were arguing that they were always the ones stuck at home answering the phones for the party, doing the cooking, looking after the kids.
Right.
So they made sure that it was the men. It was men were getting up and doing 3 hours of preparation for these breakfasts and serving them and doing all that work. I think it was quite reflective of the party, definitely.
I'm going to disagree with both Alex and Megan because not all of the leadership was sexist. For example, if we look at Emory Douglas, who was the BPP's Minister of Culture, he included women in his artwork quite frequently. He always had pictures of African American women like holding guns in empowered positions. So not all the leaders didn't want women to get involved. Some of them actually encouraged women to get involved.
Would you say, even though that's saying women would get involved, is that women in leadership, or do you think like he's painting these pictures of women with weapons and stuff, so he's empowering women in that sense? But would he necessarily agree with them being in a leadership role? Would you say?
Yeah.
Well, I would say that he's encouraging women to be the leaders of the Black Panther militia in their communities.
He's definitely he's involving them in the movement, isn't he? Like,
he could have quite
easily just left them out and paint them all male,
Yeah. There was quite a few women within the party, so I feel like he was just highlighting that, but I don't know if I would agree with him necessarily asserting them into power.
It's not like the women actually had no impact either, because when Brown was actually leader, they became a much more radical party. Like they started to contest like council seats, and they started to like get into politics a lot more, rather than just as a
positive
effect. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. I feel like they had quite an influence in the whole style of it as well. It may sound sexist with the women being associated with the style, but there was the whole Black is Beautiful movement, and like all the women and the men as well, obviously, they were all empowered to like wear their hair into natural afros, embrace the natural beauty of themselves. And I feel like that is the one thing you always see is the women of the party with these massive afros.
Yeah.
And I feel like
empowering.
I feel like that is definitely empowering to them, but at the same time, I don't often see them in the positions of the power.
Yeah.
Well, you can maybe say that the differences between the leaders in the Black Panther Party shows that maybe the leadership was quite fragmented, maybe not as organised as historians originally thought.
Yeah.
That was actually one of the aims of the FBI, was to try and split up the party by like making infighting quite a common thing, and
fight between the leaders, fight between each other. Yeah.
If they split up the party from within, then it won't take a lot to take them down.
No. Yeah. All right, I think that leads on to one of our last points, with the legacy of the Black Panther movement. Does anyone have anything on this? And
I have a few things. I looked at the historian Leigh Rayford, who traced the role of photography in the Black Panther Party.
Okay.
And he points out that he introduces a new view. He says that the Panthers did not seek to be a ghetto police or a self. They didn't really want to take part in violence.
Okay.
Rather, they just wanted to use imagery to inspire African Americans and to show
what they could do.
What they could do, what self-defense might look like. They didn't actually take part in it themselves.
Okay. Yeah, no.
Could that just be that they, sorry to interrupt, they wanted to just present this image of themselves, like the militant organisation, like with the guns, and they always dressed like in the militant, you know, they always had the leather jacket with the glasses.
Yeah. They had their own
they had that
uniform.
Yeah, they had that uniform, they had that image, and they're just maintaining that of themselves as if to like present this image like, you know, we will be those violent people that we need to be, but like don't make us be those people. Like it was just almost as a, not a fear tactic, but a way to try and prevent discrimination.
Like, this is, if you don't like give us what we want, this will happen.
Yeah.
Like, we're not scared of it.
Yeah, totally. And that's why they came and stood up to police. Well, not stood up to police officers, sorry, but like if they saw any acts of discrimination from police and things, they would go and stand nearby.
They're only
with their
aggressive if they're aggressed too.
And they always made sure any weapon they had was clearly visible.
Yeah.
They would never hide them. They would walk about holding it right in front of them.
So they knew what.
So they knew what they would willing to do.
Yeah.
Another point as well. We can also compare how Emory Douglas's art was viewed in the 1960s to how it's viewed now. During the 1960s, the images that Emory Douglas made were often perceived by politicians and law enforcement organisations as literal threats.
Okay.
Like instructing people to actually kill police.
Right. Yeah.
And kill politicians.
Mm-hmm.
They took them very literally. These paintings. Yeah.
Like in the late 1960s, the mainstream media even presented the Black Panthers as the equivalent to, let's say, Al Qaeda or ISIS or the MS-13 gang.
Yeah. That's really interesting because even J. Edgar Hoover, he declared once that the BPP was the greatest threat to internal security of the country. At the time, it was an exaggerated claim because it was while the party was still smaller, and the methods and the tactics of the group were still quite amateur. But even then, he recognized the threat that they posed, and he was, you know, one of the leading politicians at the time.
Today, people view his work like very differently. They see it more as a chrono-political act, which means visualizing a situation that doesn't exist to encourage its eventual realization.
Yep.
In other words, Douglas was trying to realize a future where black people liberated themselves through arming themselves for self-defense.
Okay.
He wasn't encouraging them to go out and kill police officers.
Yeah.
He just wanted people. Well, he just wanted African Americans to liberate themselves, to defend themselves from police brutality.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, like on another point, the legacy of the Black Panther Party obviously is very contrasting. Like, obviously people so madly think these are the greatest people for like black advancement in the world.
Yeah.
And actually, they've been mentioned twice in the House of Commons, where both times they've been related to the IRA by members of Parliament. So they just basically state that if Americans like would support the IRA, how would they feel if the British government was spending millions of pounds to the Black Panther Party and like supporting their terrorist movement? But then you have like other authors as well claiming that Malcolm X and the Panthers became national heroes in black communities by infusing abstract nationalism with street toughness. Like they've grabbed a hold of like civil rights movement by the scruff of the neck and fought for themselves.
We can also look at how the Black Panthers have been reconceptualized by historians today. Many modern academics see them as human rights activists now.
Yeah.
And this is due to biographical information published by individuals such as Jamal Joseph, who was in the Black Panther Party. Jamal Joseph shedded light on his experience in the BP, and he recalls a meeting where he discovered the lack of rhetoric encouraging violence. Instead he sorry.
No worries.
Instead, he says in his biography that he recalls the term being human rights. The term human rights being used.
Yeah,
I'm losing my thoughts.
Yeah, no, I understand
Yeah.
what you mean.
He was using the term they were using the term human rights to discuss the BP struggle rather
And terrorist
yeah.
group, yeah.
Definitely.
I understand. So with this point as well, I think we need to look at how now the Black Panther Party has been being taught as well, like how
definitely.
like, at uni, at school. What do we think about that?
I think it speaks volumes, to be honest, because like it started out as this little movement, this little party, and it just grew to this force to be reckoned with, really, within the civil rights movement. Like it was one of a number of militant groups, but it was definitely the most influential. I think the fact that it's taught so widely from throughout education, like it's taught from secondary through to university level.
Yeah.
Like even at our university in Northumbria, we've got a module in the final year completely dedicated to looking at the party. I feel like that it does speak volumes, definitely, because I feel like it just shows just how important it really was. Like some people disregard it completely just as this violent group, you know, who took matters into their own hands and were overtly violent with no necessary reason and means to do it. But there was so much more than that, and I think people overlook it. So I think the fact that it's taught just highlights how important it really was.
I think it definitely emphasises the impact that they've had on society as a whole. Because like even at the point they've only had roughly about 5,000 members.
Yeah.
And if you compare that at the time to the NAACP, they had over 500,000 members.
Yeah.
This little party is like.
It just shows the impact it had. It didn't need to have that skyrocket in membership. It just it despite having a smaller membership than most, it had one of the biggest influences of the movement, in my opinion.
Would we say that maybe the legacy of the Black Panther movement might be different in the US compared to what we view it today? Would you say, or not?
I'm not sure. I think the US public, with it having been their society, and you know, it's quite commonly known, like there's still quite the racist feeling in parts of America. I feel like that's a lot stronger there than it is here. I feel like the American public would definitely see the legacy in a different standpoint to us.
Yeah,
I do think that, because we never experienced it firsthand. We can only look at it from these different points of view. Yeah. Whereas it was their society.
Some of them might have lived.
Some might have lived through it. Like there'll still be surviving members today. Like this was only the 60s and 70s. You know. Yeah. It wasn't that long ago. No. So I feel like for those especially who live through, who still I feel like they'll have very strong opinions about it.
And just to add on to that as well, I have looked at the views of some historians in the United States. Okay. And a lot of them still today still continue to portray the Black Panther Party as the civil rights movement's evil twin, and they continue to represent Panthers as violent, racist thugs.
That's interesting to see them as the opposite to them.
Yeah,
you see, that may be a problem with US society then, and the legacy. Like, could we say that the legacy of the Black Panther movement in the US may be tarnished because of thoughts that there's still these deep-rooted problems in America with racism and...
Definitely when you still got like groups like the KKK.
Yeah, definitely.
And there's new organisations as well made by African Americans, such as Black Lives Matter. So racism is still very much an issue.
It's still prevalent,
in the United States.
Yeah.
But I feel like, just to add on at the end, that documentary I mentioned before, like that, it's a nearly 2-hour-long documentary all about the party, but it just looks at the full history, and it's really interesting because they talk to surviving members, people, you know, they talk to like the police officers that were that the party was working against, and they talk to people all who were involved in all different ways. It wasn't just solely the one-sided view from the party. I feel like it was really good, and it opened up the dialogue to both sides a bit.
Definitely.
Not massively, obviously, because it is all about the party and trying to highlight the key events and shine light on what the party was really like. But they do definitely make an effort to look from both sides. There was one interview I remember where it was a police officer, and he was describing his experience of when like the Black Panther members were directly.
Interacting with him, or
directly interacting. Like he was him and the other police officer he was working with at the time. I think they were arresting someone, and they came and they stood near, and made their presence very well known. And like he said, it was threatening. It was intimidating. Yeah, definitely intimidating situation. But they never opted for violence. They just made sure they were known. But like, I think it's really interesting to hear from the people, like the police, who lived through it, who experienced the party at the height, that weren't just from the party.
And how like the rhetoric of like this, they might say, people who live through it might be saying, it wasn't necessarily violence, it was just and how maybe that's been warped into some people
and
saying
and like him, I think he's a perfect example. Like he lived through it. He was, like I said, he interacted with them. Like he was not an ally to them at the time necessarily, but he didn't talk about them negatively. He was quite positive because he explained that he understood why now. Like he upon reflection, he understands why they were the way they were, and it was just really interesting. Like things like documentaries and films like that, I think just really interesting.
They give a good scope as well, because I think a lot of
they broaden the view of it a bit
the legacy more. At the time is very, very different to the legacy now of what we look at. So I think that's the way society's changed, the way we look at these sort of movements and stuff as well. I
think it's an important way to do it is to not just look at it from one side. I definitely think you need to open up the scope of what you're looking at 100% when you're looking at legacy.
So overall then, I think we're just going to have to have a look at what basically everyone thinks relating to the question whether or not the Black Panther Party movement were terrorists or human rights activists. Lynn first, quickly.
Well, I can see where the Black Panther Party was coming from. They just wanted equal protection from the law. They wanted to use... they wanted to arm themselves to protect themselves from the police. But even though the intentions were good, I still kind of disagree with it because it might encourage individuals to commit acts of violence.
Even though they're saying don't commit acts of violence,
even though they're saying don't commit acts, it might inspire people to do. To
With that being the basis of their image, it could influence them in untoward
what about
way.
you, Megan?
I mean, I personally lean on the side that they were human rights activists, but it's just because I see where like Flynn's coming from with the violence. They could untowardly influence people, but I think when we look at the party, and you see all the different initiatives they did to benefit their community. They did a lot of work. They found ways to get free clothing, shoes, food, housing. They found ways to get all of this for free as much as possible to benefit the community, because this was a time when they were discriminated against. A lot of black people would struggle to get employment because people wouldn't employ them because of the colour of their skin. At the same time, they were equally discriminated against in housing. They were barred from renting and applying for mortgages and things in a lot of places. And they did a lot of humanitarian efforts to benefit their community, benefit their people, because they were proud of who they were, and they wanted the rights for them as a people. They did a lot of work to benefit them. Yeah, I do think that. I think definitely human rights.
Alex, any last thoughts?
I kind of agree with Flynn with like this. I can see where the need for more black rights and a movement like this would come from, but I tend to lean to more where they were a bit too violent. This whole the whole legacy in like foreign countries, we still, if they'd be mentioned in the parliament, it'd be similar to the IRA and things like that, and maybe not so much as like a terrorist as such, but like definitely
violence.
Definitely lean more that way.
I know it hasn't been mentioned, but there was an instance even where the bookkeeper was actually she went missing for like 3 weeks and then found up dead and beaten on a beach, and in all but being arrested, the leadership was blamed for that. There's obviously like corruption and things that aren't helping. So maybe not terrorists, but definitely like thugs and violence. All
right. So I think we're going to call it there for this podcast. Thanks for joining us this week. and I hope you all found it educational. And you come back next week where we'll be looking at the legacy of Martin Luther King. All right, cheers and good night.